Calvin, what did you bring?
So I brought my new camera that I worked so hard to get.
Ooh, okay, can't wait to hear more about that. Ingrid, what did you bring?
Well, 2 photographs.
Okay. Oh, we'll know the backstory soon enough. This is just to pique your interests, everyone. First of all, welcome to this podcast, Not Quite Strangers. It's an opportunity for you all to meet 2 very unique individuals, but also it's an opportunity for them to meet and engage in a meaningful conversation. And the hope is that we build connection, inspire your curiosity, and in some way, shape, or form, challenge the status quo. My name is Valerie Hope. I am your host. And one of my greatest pleasures in life is meeting interesting people. And then the second greatest pleasure is introducing them to one another. And today we do just that. I have here Calvin Gaskin, a filmmaker out of Oakland, California, and Ingrid Gavshon, who's also a filmmaker and a leadership coach out of Berkeley, California. So you guys are neighbors. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
You guys are neighbors. I figured you didn't. I'm like, I'm going to wait until, and the big reveal will be on the podcast. You're right down the street from each other. And you both have been guests on my previous podcast, Time to Come Alive, and had such fascinating and revealing stories to share that I was like, there's no way that these 2 cannot, they need to meet. Y'all both need to meet. You need to have a conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff around filmmaking that you'll be able to share with one another. But more than anything, what I was so moved by was your passion for people, to get to know like the backstory, to be your observers. You're very keen in your observations of people and what you do. And I thought it was really interesting how much more comfortable you are behind the scenes than you are in front. Both of you share that quality. So I'm curious about exploring all of those topics. So welcome to Not Quite Strangers.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Valerie. It's just so exciting to meet you, Calvin, and to see Valerie online again.
So I have a question first before we get into the objects that you brought. Did you watch each other's podcast interview from the previous one? And if so, what stood out to you about it? Or what questions were you left with after listening or watching to any of it?
I did. I watched Ingrid's a while ago before I knew that we were going to be on together. And I was just interested generally what types of films you did. And I looked up some of your stuff and saw some exciting things happening there.
Ooh, he's been cyber stalking you, Ingrid. No stalking. And Ingrid, what about you?
I listened to your podcast. I didn't listen to the whole one, but I listened to part of the podcast when Valerie told me that she'd interviewed you. And I was like, oh, wow, there's a filmmaker down the road in Oakland, and I'd love to get a chance to meet him. And so here we are today. So this is fantastic. I've got some questions for you that I'm really curious about. So.
Ooh. All right, just hang on, patience. So a couple of things. So, you alluded to this, Ingrid, but Calvin and I met about a year ago, I think. It was a year ago because I was actually traveling to Berkeley to do some coaching with Ingrid, actually. She and I are colleagues at the Berkeley Executive Coaching Institute. That's how she and I know each other. And you happened to be driving at the time with one of the ride-share services. And we got into like really fascinating conversation. And I was like, I got to have this guy on my podcast. And that's kind of how our interaction went. And our friendship was born. And then Ingrid, you and I have been friends for now a couple years now, I guess. Well, actually, when I went through the Coaching Institute myself about 3 years ago, and then just over the past year, I've been really more and more related. But again, I'm so fascinated by what the 2 of you do. Let's hear about your object. We'll start with you, Calvin. You acquired this beautiful camera that you have showing off in the background. Tell us about it, and what is it about that camera that represents who you are as a filmmaker today?
Well, this is Queenie, my new red Dragon X. I wanted this camera for about 8 years now, and I've worked all these like small gigs filming with my other camera. My previous camera was Canon 7D, Canon 5D. I borrowed people's cameras and I also hired Red camera operators when the budget permitted. But I was like, I need to own this camera so I can, you know, do the things I want that are week-long gigs, or sometimes I'm out of the country filming for a month or so. And I'm like, oh, this is a great shot, only if I had this Red cam. Now I have the cam after not only working film gigs, but like you said, like we met, I was saving up by driving ride shares and helping my brothers on construction sites, whatever I had to do to, you know, save up. And then I was almost there, and I was getting a haircut, and my barber was always interested in my stories, and he would see me on social media. Right before I go out on these trips, I would go and get a haircut from him, and I would tell him what I'm doing. So he's like, what's next? Why are you getting a haircut? And I would tell him, and then he would see it. And he's always interested in film, and he's dabbled in acting. So he actually invested in my company and helped me get this camera. So
Wow.
I thought I was a couple years away from it, but now it just fell in my lap, really. So, you know, that's how the cookie crumbled. And really, I look at this as the beginning of my filmmaking career.
Well, that's so inspiring that whatever it is that you've been sharing with him moved in so much to make that kind of investment. And truth be told, Calvin just named his camera like literally minutes ago. So I'm curious, why Queenie?
I think.
Are you allowed to say, is that private?
No, I just think that, yeah, maybe kind of private, but you know, nice to have a queen on my arm.
There you go. Yeah. And one that you worked really hard for, you're committed to for so long. Wow, 8 years. I didn't realize that. No, great stuff. Well, we're gonna, I'm sure, see some great stuff out of Queenie in the future, or out of Calvin with Queenie at his side.
Both of us.
Both of you. All right. So Ingrid, how about you? You shared some images earlier. So tell us about, what is it about these two pictures that define you as a filmmaker?
Before I do, I've just got to say, the Red is, of course, the director of photography's dream camera. So having Queenie is going to take you far, I'm sure. You can't get better than that. So kudos to you. And
thank you.
But it sounds like you've got a great barber. I think I need to meet this man.
I need a barber, Ingrid.
Absolutely. So I've brought 2 photographs, which I photocopied because I don't have the original pictures. And these are the most extraordinary children. This young woman, Nikiwe, was 14 when I met her. She was looking after her brother and sister in a very, very poor little town. It's not even a town, a village with mud houses, proper houses, but with mud, no running water, no toilets, nothing like that. And she was looking after her brother, who was 11, Peter. And then this young man was called Stanley. And Stanley, when I met him, had scabs on his face and a runny nose and was always sick. Their parents had died of HIV, and the village had shunned them. The place where they lived had shunned them pretty much. They'd been thrown out of school. When I met them, they hadn't been to school for 4 years because the headmistress in their village wouldn't allow them to come to school because they didn't have school uniforms. And it broke my heart. And there was a competition for a woman filmmaker to do something around HIV and AIDS for a Dutch charity. And I had met a teacher who had told me about these kids. And so I went and he took me and he introduced me to the many, many orphan families in South Africa. And he took me to many families. And I said, I really want to meet these children you told me about. I just had an instinct. I don't know why I insisted. And he said, no, you've met like 3 other families. And I could have made films about any of those 3 other families. He takes me to this house, and it's got this ginormous, probably 60-foot tree when I got there, when I first met them. And there's all these kids from the neighborhood playing on this tree, climbing the tree, skipping, braiding their hair under the tree. And there is Nikiwe, this absolutely beautiful, quite silent young woman, didn't talk very much. But I was so intrigued by her that I decided to make the film about her. She didn't speak English. I didn't speak her language. And I spent a year filming her and Peter. And Peter, I have to say, it breaks my heart, because I thought at the time that I was filming, because I would always take food and I'd buy them clothes. I got a call. I was in Namibia filming, and I got a call saying Peter was in hospital because he had TB. Oh. And I said, just keep him in hospital. There are no private hospitals in that area. It's too poor. And I said, just keep him in hospital and I'll pay for any medical treatment. And by the time I got back to South Africa, 3 days later, he had passed away. Mm. So that's why these pictures really have meaning for me.
Mm. Wow. Nikiwe and Peter. That's beautiful. And so did you do a film on both, or just Nikiwe?
I did a film about the family. It's Nikiwe. And I just made a mistake. This is Stanley, the older brother, who was kind of wild and uncontrollable. Nikiwe couldn't control him, was into drugs, and he was running cigarettes and booze for people, and they'd give them like 10 cents, American cents, equivalent of 10 cents. And that would supposedly feed them. The people in the village would have them carrying crates of beer, or who knows what else they would think. But Peter was wild. But Nikiwe, I felt really, really close to, and I made this film about her. I got the funding. I was the one that was chosen. I sent them a VHS, if you remember VHS tapes, that old-fashioned thing called a VHS.
Never heard of it.
I sent them a VHS tape of the footage, even unedited, because at that stage editing was really expensive. And these kids playing under the tree, this young woman, I had this teacher do a brief interview with her. And she was pretty much monosyllabic, but I got to make the film about her. And it's
wow.
in my heart.
You both are so clearly passionate about filmmaking. And you kind of put us in the middle of your journeys, right, as filmmakers. But I'm curious about, what was it about filmmaking, or what is it about filmmaking that continues to light a spark for you?
I think for me, the more and more I get into it, the more I understand how powerful of a tool the storytelling and filmmaking is, and filmmaking as the medium. And there's so many stories I want to tell, but also other people who don't have a voice that I can collab with and help them tell their story. So that really does it for me.
Telling the story. Yeah. And Ingrid, I know it's been a while since you've done some of your own filmmaking, but I'm curious about, what is it that still holds an interest for you, or is compelling to you about it?
There's something about the human story that is so compelling. And I got into filmmaking because I wanted to change the world, and I wanted to help bring other people's stories forward, that people could see how other people live, or understand their lives, or understand their culture, or understand the hardships that they've endured. Especially in a country like South Africa, where the gaps are so high, and people weren't necessarily interested in other people's lives. There'd been so much pain because of apartheid. And I wanted to give back to the people in the country, and I wanted to tell the history, and I wanted to tell the history in a way that people could receive it, and they were more likely to receive it in a film. As Calvin says, you know, give voice to the voiceless, and I was so privileged that people agreed to let me make a film about them. I felt so honored that people allowed me to tell their story.
You know, it's interesting. I don't think I got it until this moment, even after having extensive conversation with the two of you, but I'm like, not a filmmaker. I'm not a filmmaker. And I feel like it resonates so deeply with me, what you both share, because I love hearing people's stories. I love just understanding who they are and why they think the way they think and what's shaped them. And, you know, that's why, you know, Calvin, poor Calvin was just trying to do his job. And I'm like, so tell me about, what about this? And then what about that? And that's really my life. Now, don't bring it to life on film. I think sometimes for me is just my own, satiate my own curiosity. But I think what inspired me to have a podcast like this one, or even the one prior to, is sharing with people, like, here's some fast people. This world is filled with fascinating people. You should get to know some of them. Here are the ones that I've met, you know, so it's kind of like that. It's not, and I didn't really get that until both of you reflected what filmmaking means to you. And I'm like, oh, not that I necessarily need to make films, but I think in my own way, shape, or form, I'm introducing to the world, you know, here's some folks that you should get to know. Go get curious about them. I'm curious about, as you're hearing the two of you talk about what's inspired your film, or what, you know, what calls to you as a filmmaker, what are some things that you're noticing, or what are things that are resonating for you, or maybe even questions that you now have about this?
I want to find out about Calvin's passion for film, because you just, like, your face lights up and you exude this passion as you talk about it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, she's talking my language. So I'm curious about you. Did you always want to be a filmmaker? How did you get into filmmaking? How did it all begin? I know you've flown all over the world to make films. I'm curious about those films. Love to see them. So,
oh my gosh, Ingrid, she wants to have her own podcast about you, Calvin. All right, so pick one of those questions, Ingrid, and you can ask. Yeah, let's go.
You choose what you want to answer.
How I got started and why I chose this path is kind of by accident. I had to pick a course in high school. And I saw that they had a video production course, and I was like, yes, that's it. But I was told not to take it seriously. And when you go on to higher education, do marketing communications, or, you know, get a PhD or something like this. But film kept coming back to me, even though I pushed it away. And wanted to, you know, make my parents proud and follow in the footsteps of my family members who are all in the same line of work, of doing contract work and real estate and stuff like this. I even went to real estate classes. And I just couldn't. I couldn't. And then I was always the guy with the video camera in my hand, just filming everything. And it just hit me one day that I'm just going to follow this path. And every story, every part of me, all the duality of who I am can be told through this camera. Either it's a funny or a serious story. I can tell this with this career path.
All right, Ingrid, I see you nodding. What? Yeah, so I'm curious, what's that like to hear?
I understand it. There's something that pulls you in. I started off taking photographs, and then it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough just capturing that moment in, that frozen moment. I needed to do more. I needed to dig more. I needed to be able to have a bigger canvas to tell people's whole life story, because there are photographers that capture that moment and you see a person's life. But I wanted the complexity of both the visual and how you constructed a story, and how you dig and you unpeel that onion and you get deeper to find out more about people. And that, for me, is so compelling. And I will never not make films. The last one I finished was about 3-4 years ago, and I've got another one in mind, but I'm thinking I must talk to Calvin about this one.
Yes.
I'm curious, how do you peel those layers and make people go deeper into their stories?
Just being open, not needing to be being there, being curious, asking people, finding some commonality. Even when I filmed people, right wingers in South Africa, I had to find something, some humanity somewhere, in order to be able to relate. I mean, there's a funny story. This woman kept a baboon as a pet, but it was so big that it was almost as big as her. She was probably about 5'4", 5'5", and she'd carry it on her back, take him out of the cage. And we were in this very small, very conservative town, and she was a member of this far right wing organization called the AWB, which is similar to Proud Boys, or very far right, and a lot of people had died at their hands, and they were very much anti what was happening in South Africa as South Africa was opening up. But I managed to find this humanity, talking to her about her pet baboon as if it was her child. And so it's about meeting people where they're at, I guess. About just looking and trying to see what's beyond, what's not being said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can appreciate that common humanity. And I think, even for the two of you, I should say that both of you are documentary filmmakers. I want to make sure that make that distinction. I think, right? Yes, documentary strictly, Calvin, or are you dabbling in other parts?
I am dabbling in everything, but I think primarily documentarian.
Okay, got that. But I think, yeah, that idea of, we all have the human story is it exists for every single human being on earth, regardless of where you were born, what school you went to, what upbringing you had, what hobbies you prefer. Like, there's no element of humanity that is so unique, right? There's always a thread running through. And I think that's really compelling for me. And, these are the fact that both of you are filmmakers and you both love documentary filmmaking. It's pretty obvious thread. One thread that I found interesting, and I don't know a lot of filmmakers, so I can't say that I go around talking to a bunch of filmmakers necessarily, but I also heard from both of you in our individual conversations how you prefer to be behind the scenes, right? Behind the camera. And both of you seem to shy away a bit, from being center stage. So I'm curious about two things. One is, what is this experience like, having to be up front? This for the second time too. And then also, what is it about being behind the scenes what does that view afford you that perhaps those of us who are maybe out front don't get to experience? So what is it like for you now being up front? And then what is it that you get from being behind the scenes?
Well, for me, I'm a little bit less nervous this time. The first time I was completely nervous, but right before I came on with you, I was taking a reeducation class, and I was speaking with everyone. So all those nerves went out the door, and I'm here now. And
Okay.
and I don't think I'm a great speaker. So that's one thing that allows me to be comfortable behind the camera. And I only ask, certain questions. I'm not just talking. But also allowing me to pick up on the knowledge that the people, the subject is giving me. I just love, like, every film shoot that I'm on, I'm learning something. And people usually go on camera for a big reason, to tell a great story. So I'm always around that, and that's just something that's so rewarding for me.
Mm. To
I
get
can see me growing as the years go on. Film has changed who I am, for real.
wow. And it's I think an interesting thought to have an insight about how much we grow hearing other people share their story,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
And that's not something that would be common knowledge. I think it happens clearly because or else humans wouldn't be compelled to tell any stories at all. But I think what you're pointing to is your desire to listen to the story, and your openness to receiving the story is what helps us grow.
Mhm.
Right? Hearing a story doesn't necessarily do anything. It's really our receptivity to it. So that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Ingrid, what would you say to that question? What is it like for you now? And what is it that you get to see because you're behind the scenes often?
It's such a great question. And last time you asked such great questions, which are still bending my mind now today. So what does one get to see? Being behind the camera it's a gift. You're getting to know people. You can ask people pretty much anything about themselves and their lives. But I was always curious. I was never going to be in one narrow profession where, doctor, accountant, where there is just very, very narrow parameters. I'm a very wide-ranging thinker. So it allowed me to follow my passion, and I'd come across a story. It would be one line in a newspaper, and that would spark an idea for a film, or there would be a big issue happening in South Africa, or I happened to meet somebody that I think, wow, this person is really interesting and people should know more about this person. So, like these two children, or like my friend Duma, who'd been on death row for 6 or 8 years for a crime he hadn't committed. And I happened to meet him when I was working on a film for Discovery. And I thought people should meet him. He's this extraordinary man. He had this wonderful, very deep, resonant voice and the largest hands you've ever seen. And he was the most humble man and caring man, and had suffered so much pain that I wanted to tell his story. And so I was so privileged, I was so lucky that most of the films that I proposed, I got to make because people believed enough in me or in the story to give me enough money to go and make that film. And it was such a gift, because I got to interview presidents, politicians in America, in India, in South Africa, but I got more from the people I filmed, like a lady in a village that spoke no English and had no education, but the wisdom still stays with me today. I can still see some of the people that all the people that I filmed. I know everybody that I filmed, and I remember each and every film. But it's an honor and it's a gift, and it allows you to have a broader picture of a subject. and then to delve into the subject, whether it's an investigative film or a documentary film, to actually dive in. Whereas drama is much more prescribed. There is a script and you stick to the script and you don't go off script. But with a documentary film, you start off with an idea and you keep digging. And for me, what was great, I could go for tangents and I could follow those tangents, because often those tangential questions would lead to something much deeper and richer and more interesting and more revealing about the person or the subject. And for me, that was, I get so excited.
You're so excited, in fact, that there's these lights. I don't know if those are generated. They weren't there before, but there are lights behind you, like these little, like almost rainbows. So interesting. Both of you have said this in slightly different ways, but there's something about the filmmaking that you've done, or the subjects that you've connected with, that has changed you. What change did you make, or can you remember? I'm sure there are many things, but if there was one that you could point to that you would attribute to a film that you did or a person that you met in filming, like what was the change and what was it that made it so meaningful?
For me, I think I talked about this on our first interview, but deciding what my moral compass is right then and there on this documentary I was filming in India. It's like, what will I film, and when will I turn the camera off and say that's enough? You know, and as I'm in India, we're shooting a like an experimental verite style documentary where we're just letting things unfold. And Victor, the guy I was filming, took me across this river where they do cremations in Varanasi, India. And all of a sudden, he's asking me as the director to film this family cremating their family member. And I'm not sure if I wanted to do that or not, especially without their permission. And that was the main reason I did it, was, getting the okay from those family members and talking to Victor about what this shot means to the story. How is this helping the story? If it's not, then, I'm not filming it for B-roll. But after talking to the family members and talking to him and realizing that this moment is exactly what Victor is talking about, is saying how he was saying, just basically the point of the film. The film isn't out yet, so I want you to see this.
Is this 12 Bends?
This is 12 Bends, yes. And it was a tough moment. I learned and I grew at that moment, as a filmmaker, what my green lights are, what my red lights are, but also how to come to that conclusion.
That's really fascinating. I think going back to what you both said about storytelling, that when we hear other people's stories and experiences, that does do that for us, right? It tells us, we either experience contrast, like, nope, I would never do that, or that does not resonate, or no, I don't agree, or whatever version of that we have. But I think the point that you're making is there is something that you did to engage with your instinct, right? There's one thing to have the instinct and just like, nope, I'm not doing it. Sorry, Victor. I don't feel comfortable with it. But it sounds like you really, what you said, you got to determine okay, so am I going to make this a green light or a red light in a very conscious way? And having a conversation with the family and having a conversation with him about the value is what helped that shift. And I think sometimes in conversation with other people, that's what shuts down communication so frequently, is because we choose not to, we choose our instinct over our consciousness, right? We just react and go, nope, I'm not interested, or I disagree. And that's it, conversation's over. Whereas if we could just stay open long enough to explore, man, I don't know, I'm feeling uncomfortable with this. Let me find out more about why and what would make a difference, right? So that's fascinating.
And on top of that, it's like as the cinematographer for that shoot, it's like, okay, that's my role. What I'm here to film what the director wants in his film. That's my job. He's telling me to film it. I should film it, you know, and am I even able to say no to that? You know, so that was the other question going through my head. It was a lot at that moment, on top of seeing what I was seeing. It was tough to, you know.
Wow. Ingrid, I'm curious what's going through your mind. I see you nodding there. So what are you thinking as Calvin shared that?
First of all, I'd love to see this film. The very first, well, the second film, documentary that I worked on was for Dutch television in India, and I spent 4 months in India, and it was mind-blowing and changed my world and changed my life and the trajectory of my life, of where I was going to go and what I was going to do. Because up until then, I'd worked in news in London, but I hadn't, you know, really worked in documentaries, although documentaries was where I wanted to work. So it sounds fascinating. And yes, there are these moral dilemmas, and what do you do and how do you cross that line? And I've turned down work where I've been asked to film things where it didn't sit with me, or there are places that I did not want to go, to countries that I did not want to go, because I would be showing the wrong side. I'd be on the wrong side of history. And so I just turned down some of those jobs. And I think not every film, a lot of the films I've made changed me and widened my horizons and informed me, because I chose films to work on films that would feed my curiosity. You know, occasionally there's a film that you make about a company or you know, those kind of films, but my films, my documentary films, they changed me. And I guess I can't, you know, I was so fortunate. I got to make a number of films about Nelson Mandela. And the first one I made was fascinating because I was told by this museum, we've got all this footage of Mandela talking, and this was like some famous American had filmed it, and I was like, oh my gosh. And then I looked at the footage, and you'll understand, Calvin, they hadn't asked him to talk about it in nouns. So he talked about, yes, I was there, but he didn't say I was on Robben Island, or yes, when they'd asked him where he was arrested, he said, yes, I was, and he didn't talk about, you know, and there was very little to string together to make the content work. And so I came up with another concept of talking to everybody else around him that knew him at various stages of his life, and then they could fill in the gaps and we could use his voice. And that was really life-changing for me. And the other film, the first HIV film I did, was in a village. I'd gone with a friend to his little cottage in the country, and he had 2 friends, British friends, who were visiting from this hospital in an area of the east of South Africa, KwaZulu. And it was the beginning of the HIV pandemic in South Africa. It was like 1994, I think, or 1993. And I met these women, and it was really curious, and it was interesting to hear about what they're talking about. And they said, oh, we just asked this filmmaker to come and film this workshop for us. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Whatever. 6 months later, they phoned me and said that the guy never turned up. Can you come and do it? We've got a budget of $2,500, even less. So, and I'm like, okay, sure. So I spoke to the cooperative that I belong to, and I said, well, can we put in the camera equipment for free, and we'll just pay for a sound person and a director of photography? And they said, sure, and for the air tickets. Anyway, cut a very long story short, it was extraordinary. It was the first film where people with HIV were actually talking about it in South Africa, because at that stage the numbers were very low, because South Africa had been so isolated during apartheid. It had been isolated, and unfortunately they didn't handle it right. And then of course it exploded exponentially and spread exponentially. And that was probably the biggest life-changing film that I made.
Yeah. You're going to say something, Calvin?
I was just going to say, wow.
I can already tell there's so much more. I mean, if we had hours and hours, I'm sure you would go into so much more information and detail about your experiences, but I think you drew out some fascinating distinctions. And Ingrid, what you said earlier about, this project with Mandela and him not giving enough context, right, in what he shared, but then the idea of talking to people around it, that's actually quite brilliant. It's funny enough because I, in my family, we just started doing this recently. My dad, he's 75 or 76 now, and has this real deep passion for like everyone in the family getting to know one another, like beyond the things that we know of each other, like really getting to know each other better. And so I proposed to him that we do what I call get to know you in 20, which means I source questions from all of our family members, relatives, cousins, aunts, uncles, everybody. And I interview my relative, in this case, my dad was the first one, interview them on video. And I asked the 20 questions that I got from the family. And so at the end of his 20 questions, he nominated his youngest sister. Now he's one of 9. So he nominated, so there's a huge age gap between the two. He's like, I don't really, I want to know her more. And it's so interesting how much I even learned about my dad or the context of his life through talking to my aunt, which I'd never had that level of conversation. And now she's chosen my younger brother, ironically, so a whole different generation. And what you're pointing to is, yeah, the people in the periphery actually do fill out the frame, right? Like you get to see the frame of a person's life by hearing other people's stories in relation to, or perhaps knowing that, oh, that wasn't even in the frame at all. I could talk to you guys all day. I have so many more questions, but we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately. But I want to zoom out a little bit, and this pun intended, I want to zoom out a bit and talk about what has this experience been like? First of all, you kind of heard each other's initial podcast. You had a sense of each other. But what has it been like having this conversation today and having, really met each other today?
I think it's been awesome meeting Ingrid and really not knowing who she is as a person, just seeing, some of her work and hearing about how she's worked with Mandela. Knowing you, I see that you'll be a nice person to have behind the camera, asking those great questions and talking with the subject about, opening up, sort of like how Valerie does, gets people to really go deep and come alive.
Hey, that's what makes Ingrid such a great coach too. I don't know, Calvin, you might have another side hustle. I mean, you have the camera now, so maybe you don't need it, but coaching, hey, Ingrid might recruit you. Anything else, Calvin, about that?
No, that's it.
Huh? Ingrid, what about for you? How's this experience been?
It's been fantastic because since I've been here in the Bay Area, I've been thinking I have to find a good person to work with, to collaborate with. And I've got a project about an amazing man, musician, archivist, expert in spirituals that I'm wanting to make a film about, and I've been thinking, I don't know the right person to work with, to collaborate with on this. I need a DOP who's got soul, and I think I've just found the person. So I am really excited to continue this conversation sometime in the not too distant future. And as to your point, Valerie, about you interviewing your family, I think it's amazing. And I think everybody, cell phones are cheap.
Yeah.
Memory is cheap now. Go and interview your mother, your father, your granny, your grandpa, your uncles, your aunts, because one day you really will want that history, because that history will be lost. And I think it's such a gift to have those stories. No more, because I think as children, and you and I have talked about this, Valerie, as children, one have a certain preconception of one's life and one's parents and one's upbringing, and one never gets to interrogate it until it's too late.
Yeah.
And so I think everybody should be like Valerie, ask questions of everybody.
I agree.
You might be surprised about what you find, and you might be delighted by what you find. You might find endless seams of amazing stories that people can tell and share about their lives.
Well, thank you for saying that. I love doing what I do, and I don't take for granted, even for the two of you or any of my other guests, what it takes to trust me enough to say yes a second time, and to do it, to meet a complete stranger and have a conversation about something that's so meaningful to you. So I don't take that for granted. I'm so honored that both of you agreed to do it. Curious, what surprised you or delighted you in this conversation? Calvin.
I think what surprised me is just like I said earlier, not knowing who Ingrid was before, and talking to her, just seeing the depth of who she is and what her mission is with the medium of filmmaking is awesome. And it's great to meet people like this, and who aren't just in this industry just for the nicest looking footage, but the stories that need to be told. For me, it's like, I don't come from a wealthy family or anything, and having a good job is important, but I chose a different route that's sort of here and there, but I know the importance of what I'm doing, and if I follow that, I'll get to where I need to be.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And you might have a documentary made about you, Calvin, because you're, as colorful and colorful in the positive sense, right? As your life, at least the bits of pieces that I've gotten to learn about, there's so much richness and there's so much depth there. And I'm so excited that you chose to follow this passion, even though you pushed it away several times for so many years. I always said, we're granted gifts so that we can give them away. Our job is to find the gift that we got and give it away to others, and give it as long as you have them, right? So happy to hear that you're doing that. Ingrid, what about you? Any surprises or anything that
Well, I knew from what I'd heard on the podcast, I knew from that conversation when you said, I just had this like fascinating conversation with this amazing man who's a filmmaker, and he was like, just brought me here to Berkeley, and I'm like, okay, that's good. Filmmaker in Oakland, that sounds pretty cool. Yeah, I'm up for meeting this person sometime. And then unfortunately, time went by, and then COVID hit, and I just felt a kindred spirit. I feel like I'm hearing somebody like who has my passion. That's not driven by money, but it's driven by this want to explore the world and tell people stories and dig deeper into people's souls and help them find their way of expressing who they are. And I think that's fantastic.
What are you guys taking out of this conversation? Like, Calvin, Ingrid might be calling you soon to talk about her project. So we know that. But just for yourselves, I know both of you mentioned how important it is as you're listening to others, you're learning, and there's stuff about your own beliefs or your own perspectives that changes as a result. And in just a short time, has anything shifted, or what are you taking from this?
Recently I've been just getting a new camera and going through these courses for the last 4 days, like very intense training and learning both in camera settings and post-production. And I'm getting my head wrapped all in that, like the beautiful shots, most clear, crisp, the setup, the setting, the lighting. But what I'm taking from this and what I'm getting is the reminder about what I should begin this new chapter of my career is the storytelling, is what I'm putting out there for people, my legacy,
To focus in even more on your storytelling. I mean, Queenie's going to tell some great stories, I'm sure.
Hopefully. And I know it helps for people to watch beautiful, nice shots, that's going to draw the attention, but it's all about that story. I don't care if you have that filming it on an iPhone, like Ingrid said, whatever camera you have, like we are doing this Zooms, people are learning just as much from Zoom interviews than these big $500 million Tom Cruise films.
Oh, I got put in the same category as Tom Cruise, like, really? No. I won't take it that far, but I want to admit though, Calvin, I remember when you and I spoke, I think it was after the podcast. I don't think it happened during the conversation, but after the podcast, and I'd asked you for some feedback or something, you said, it'd be great to have had like clips of some of my films, or like, and you mentioned all of these different upgrades. And a part of me was kind of like, yeah, I get that. I mean, I know I could definitely go fancier. Like, you can be told this is fairly basic even now. And but a strong part of me, talk about like that moral compass that you were mentioning earlier, a strong part of me was like, it's about the people and the story. Like, they can Google you. And I'm not nothing, if I had the production staff or whatever, I'm sure I'm like, all right, get some B-roll going when he's talking about XYZ, right? I'm sure that would be amazing at some point in time. But I remember that moment made me really reflect on like how much do I want to invest in the external or the exterior, the presentation, let's call it that, like the presentation of the information, and how much do I want to focus on the content? So I've done a few little things here and there to upgrade bits and pieces, but I think I really thought, no, that helped me really define that, no, it's about the content. I want to get really good stories. I want to get really great information, to ask great questions, get people curious enough to follow up on more. That's like what I'm here about. So thank you. Thank you for saying what you said, because it really had me question, kind of like Victor had you question some things, had me go like, where do I want to, and there's a lot of podcasters out there doing some amazing things. And, they have so many great tools nowadays, and some of them very affordable, some of them, all that, but I'm like, nah, I prefer the conversation. So thank you. It's good stuff. What about you, Ingrid? What are you taking?
I think that you've created something really special and interesting by bringing people together who've got some common threads, and you're actually just creating this tapestry and binding all our lives together in a way that's going to be beautiful. And hopefully there'll be future collaborations, and hopefully we'll get you on set sometime too, sort of
happy to.
I think that meeting somebody else who's as driven and passionate, and just that's what you want to do, and there's no stopping you, and you will go far and you will do well. I have no doubt about that. And I would love to at some stage get together and meet somewhere down the drag in Oakland, because I'm near Oakland, and just to chat more and to see some of your work, and
I would love that.
that journey somehow. It would be fantastic.
What were you going to say, Calvin?
That would be awesome. I can see that happening. We'll stay connected for sure.
Fantastic.
Good. Well, you don't have to do it now, but I do encourage all my guests, exchange contact information. I do not have to be the middle person in this at all, but I would love to make sure that that you continue to explore what could potentially be there. Perhaps there's other resources or connections that you all have that could expand what you do. So, I mean, you guys are both doing some really important work, right? Really important work. There's so much depth and soul in what you both bring, and the intention behind it. And hopefully people who are listening and watching this now much more inspired, whether it is to watch what you all have both produced, but also maybe take on their own. Like you said, Ingrid, go out and get your iPhone or your Android and start filming people in your family, interview them. I did that with my nieces and nephews. It's so funny now that I've been doing this all my life. All my life, I'm like talking to people and asking questions. I have footage of my nieces and nephew when they were 6, 7, 8 years old. Now she's 15. My eldest niece is 15. She actually recorded the outro for my podcast. See, Calvin, I did do a little upgrade.
There you go.
I have a little outro that she recorded because I was like, oh man, she's such a great speaker, even at that age. But there's things that I now learn about the people in my life because I've asked questions, because I've been kind of involved. I've had a front row seat, if you will. Love that. Love that. Any final thoughts or comments, anything you'd like to share with each other before we wrap it up?
I think everyone who's thinking about becoming a filmmaker, just go out and do it. Just test the waters. You'll get better at every single part. And these days it really doesn't take much. You really don't need a camera like that, but don't take no for an answer. If that's what you want to do, just go out and make it happen. Mm-hmm. And share it with the world.
Yeah. Just start. Ingrid, anything to add and final words?
Even if you don't want to be a filmmaker per se, just stay curious. Ask people questions. Be curious about the people around you. Actually reach out to people around you, people that maybe you wouldn't normally be talking to, and find out more about them, because therein lies the richness. Yeah. And what we do as filmmakers is we bring that to your lounge, to your computer, your television, whatever it may be, your cell phone. But there are so many people out there and everybody has a story. So just be curious.
Lovely. One thing I learned about myself, really, in my conversations with you, Ingrid, specifically the podcast, because I'm always the curious person and ask these questions, and this is kind of reflected in all ages at all times in my life. What I think made the biggest impact is I didn't realize the impact that our conversation had on you. Right? You shared with me that there were things that were still bending your mind, and I take for granted, I really do, because I have these types of conversations so frequently, but I take for granted, or at least at the moment, I felt I took for granted that even getting curious and asking people questions has such a potentially profound impact on the person. So like what Calvin said, you mentioned, Calvin, about how hearing a story changes you. I didn't realize, and I just now started to connect the dots. So this is what I'm taking out of this conversation myself. It's connecting the dots. Like when Ingrid, you said that, those questions were mind bending, that oh, I actually have a role to play in creating the type of, changing, life-changing, perhaps a perspective shifting experience by prompting a certain level of conversation.
Mhm.
And I don't think I ever really got that at the level which that you indicated until that. I'm like, okay, yeah, we had a great conversation. But I'm like, yeah, all my podcasts seem great, but I think can take responsibility, right? Even more responsibility for having brought that to light by asking certain questions, by being curious about certain aspects of your lives and the impact that has on the person that's answering. So really good stuff. Oh my goodness. You all,
Valerie, the connector.
the connector. Woo, awesome. Oh, this has been so much fun. So much fun. I'm so honored the two of you said yes and are willing to continue to connect. And there's so much more. I know that there's tons of questions that you all have, and you're probably going to geek out about stuff that I have no idea about. Camp Red and all kinds of terms and 5D, or I don't know, all the comments you made earlier. But just want to say profound thank you to both of you for saying yes, for showing up, for sharing so deeply in such a short period of time. Gives us such richness, rich glimpses into who you are as people and what you value and what makes a difference. And then also whatever art and creativity you're putting out into the world. Thank you for that too. Thank you for what you've done, and thank you for what you're about to do. Can't wait to hear more about that. And please do share if there's other there are links that you want to share. I'll make sure I put that in the notes.
Awesome.
Good. Whoo, thank you. This is cool. Look at that. Everybody, good feelings all around, everyone. So I hope that those of you listening and watching also felt inspired by this conversation. There's many more conversations around you. Go have them. Go have them. Whether you film them or not, just go have them. And if you have not already subscribed, please go to www.notquitestrangers.com so you can subscribe. Make sure that you get this episode and every other episode in your inbox. That's super important. I don't want you to miss a single thing. And actually, Ingrid and Calvin, you guys don't know about this, but another upgrade I've made is because these conversations are so important, and both of you mentioned how meaningful it is to actually go out of ourselves, right, to share with others. Every other week, we send out a connection challenge. So not only do you get a chance to watch an interesting conversation or listen to an interesting conversation, but you also get in your inbox a connection challenge where you now can go out into your own life and find interesting things about the people around you, whether you know them or not. So if you're interested in getting those connection challenges, make sure that you subscribe. And so excited to see what else unfolds as I learn through this journey, what's next and what's there for my guests and my listeners. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this episode. Again, Ingrid, Calvin, million thanks for sharing what you shared. Looking forward to seeing so much more. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone. Thank you.
You've been listening to the podcast Not Quite Strangers. Be sure to subscribe or follow on your favorite video or podcast platform. And for more information and content, go to notquitestrangers.com. See you next time.